Thanks for tuning in to Conversations with Betty LaMarr, coming to you live from the Bluff City. Conversations is weekly wall-to-wall talk about all things Memphis and the Mid-South. Conversations with Betty include people just like you, living on the Bluff, doing what you do to uplift the city of Memphis.
Hi, Betty. Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
I am so excited to have you here. For one thing, we're going into the holiday season right now, and substance abuse is prevalent even when we're not going into the holidays. But when we think about the holidays, we do think about drunk driving, people being depressed, and going into the bottle or whatever substance abuse of choice. So before we get into all of that, Karen, tell us exactly who you are and what you do.
Okay. Well, I have been in the addiction industry for about 30 years. I've worked as an addiction professional, mainly with those with a substance use disorder. And I have my bachelor's in psychology, and I'm working on my master's in counseling, though I've been doing counseling for, like I said, about 30 years. So my role is to help people to understand the disease of addiction and to find appropriate ways of arresting it. It is an illness, and it's a lifelong illness, but recovery is certainly possible.
Okay, well, let's start from the beginning, Karen. I know most people that are counselors in professions similar to yours, they also have a journey. Let's start with your journey. What brought Karen Morgan to where you are today?
Okay. Well, I am a person in long-term recovery. And what that means is that I actually developed an addiction to alcohol and to other mind-altering substances pretty early. I was 19 when I originally got sober. And as a result, I found it necessary to work with others who are struggling with this disease and helping them to achieve recovery.
Okay, so is there a scientific, diagnosis or reason that some people become addicted where others do not?
Well, there's a lot of variables at play. And so addiction impacts the brain. So it is actually a brain disorder. It is actually a mental health condition. People try to separate it, but it's another condition that does tend to co-occur with other conditions like anxiety and depression and things of that nature. But like I said, it impacts the brain and the different areas of the brain. And so depending on the substance, depending on the age of the person when they begin really kind of overindulging in the substance, all of that takes into consideration whether or not someone becomes addicted. Also, it's important to point out there is a genetic link. So there's a predisposition. So if you have a blood relative, particularly a close blood relative, then you are actually likely to develop an addiction just like they did. And then beyond that is your environment. So if your environment is not conducive to a successful childhood and a successful upbringing, so say if there is a lot of poverty or someone else in your family that uses substances, or there's a lot of dysfunction within the family, violence and things of that nature, then that person is more likely to develop an addiction.
Okay, so I've always been curious about this, Karen. Does substance abuse normally start as a rule with alcohol and progress, or is it just the first drug that you use, a first substance that you use?
Again, that varies. So I'm thinking you're asking the gateway question.
Yes.
And there really is no hard evidence to support the gateway theory. So it's really more on a continuum. And so what we have found as far as research studies are concerned is that alcohol and marijuana are generally more available. They're more accessible. So that, and tobacco for that matter. And so that's why you see a lot of people that actually begin with that. But that doesn't mean because they do, they're going to automatically graduate to a substance that's considered to be harder. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
Okay, so is it a fact that, when you, I guess, get addicted to a drug, that it affects somehow, is it the dopamines or whatever it is in the brain, I know, that causes a person to become addicted in the first place? Or do they just like how they feel?
Well, what happens is it causes a release of dopamine into the brain, and it actually is an overpowering amount of dopamine. Now, dopamine isn't necessarily the feel-good neurotransmitter. Dopamine actually, what it does is it reinforces behavior. So if it's almost like mother's milk, to some people. Again, if that brain is predisposed, there are going to be some kids, for instance, adolescents who maybe try marijuana or they take a drink and they're like, oh, I don't want any more to do with this. And they're done. And other kids are like, yeah, it's kind of fun. I might do it, here and there. And then some kids are like, oh, wow, this is like mother's milk. I have to have this all the time, and again, that depends a lot on what their genetics are, what their environment has been, and where they are in their stage of life.
Okay, well, is it possible for a person to become addicted to substance without any history or genetics whatsoever in the family?
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely, it's possible. It's just more prevalent when you introduce those ideas, those other areas. So that we're talking about risk factors versus protective factors. Okay. So risk factors include your environment, not having close relationships with people, coming from maybe a divorced home, a violent environment, an environment where you have, where there's like an acceptance of drug use. Those are risk factors.
So basically anything, before we go to this break, basically anything can set you off if you already have that tendency. Stand back, Karen. Stay tuned. We'll be right back with more Medical Talk. Welcome back to Medical Talk. I'm Betty LaMarr. My guest today is Karen Morgan, addiction recovery professional. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today, Karen. Okay, I know you have a wealth of information, and as I said earlier, we're going into the holidays, and so many people are depressed and they're sad, so they go to substance. But let me ask you this. How can a family make or break, if you will, the cycle of addiction? Say like if you're a mother, so many parents are in denial about their children and their addiction, and some even enable. So let's talk a little bit about that, and I want you to describe enable for those out there that may not know they're enabling their child or loved one that's addicted.
Well, there's a huge difference between enabling and helping, so enabling would be doing for someone what they're capable of doing for themselves and what they really should do for themselves. Paying for their way when they're, when they should have a job, when they should be self-sufficient, getting them out of trouble as far as rescuing them from their consequences. Consequences are wonderful. We celebrate consequences because that's how people learn and grow, is through having consequences. And so if you rescue them and they don't have to experience those consequences, then you're enabling that behavior to continue. And so that's true of any behavior, whether it's involving substance use disorder or not.
Okay, so do you think that for the parents or loved ones that I said like an ostrich, put the head in the sand. Do you think it's because they just don't want to accept the fact that their loved one is addicted or in trouble? And Karen, what's the difference between being an alcoholic and a person that just like to, as they say, well, I just drink because, I'm just hanging out with friends or I go to the bar. What's the difference? How do you know if that person is an alcoholic or just like to go out and drink?
Well, I mean, you're describing casual drinking, and there certainly is nothing wrong with casual drinking. It's when it gets in the way, when it infringes on your responsibilities, when you're unable to perform your daily activities responsibly, when you can't make it to work, when you're late, if you're driving under the influence or using heavy machinery under the influence. Or as a mother or anyone that's a caregiver of a child, and you're falling asleep or you're passing out, when you're supposed to be caring for the child, these are definite signs that there is a problem, that it's gone way beyond casual use. And so yes, so that would be the difference. And basically wanting to stop and being unable to. Or having, a strong motivation to stop using the substance, and yet you just can't not do it. That's pretty indicative of addiction. And then you asked me another question about, I can't recall what it was.
That's okay, because I sort of threw it all up against the wall because I don't want to miss out on a single thing. I guess I was asking about and you answered that question, how do you know the difference? Because some people drink a lot. However, they say, I'm not an alcoholic. But let me take it here with you. How young, to your knowledge, does a person start drinking? Because we are filming here at Germantown High School. So how long, is there a certain age that addiction can start with a young person? Let's go there a little bit.
Absolutely. Yes, it's very, very risky for young people, and that means be under the age of 25, because the brain actually doesn't complete developing until around 25. And so it's the prefrontal cortex that's the last area of the brain to develop. And so that's what we see in our adolescents. They're risk takers, they're rebellious, they don't think before they do things. That's what happens. That's that last part of the brain to develop. And so that places them at a much greater risk. If they begin to use a substance, they will become addicted, and they can become addicted pretty quickly. The other question you had asked about sticking the head in the sand, just being in denial of your loved one's substance abuse. And I think a lot of that has to do with a variety of things. So it's about really not understanding the illness. There's still very much a stigma attached to that. And so it is a medical issue. This is a public health issue. This is not criminal justice issue. This is about changing the brain, which of course impacts behavior. And so I think with parents in particular, they tend to feel like I must have done something wrong. So there's something inherently wrong with me, with my parenting, that my child is displaying. And so the first thing that I tell parents is, this is not your fault. And anyone, you didn't cause it, you can't control it, and you can't cure it. But you can help change. You can help initiate change by recognizing the signs and symptoms, and by being willing to hold them accountable and tell them that you love them, and that this is what you see and this is what your concerns are, and setting boundaries, and then living within those boundaries. A lot of people can set boundaries all day long, but the problem is holding them. You have to hold them. So you never say it if you can't back it up. You have to be able to back it up.
Okay, Karen, I'm going to use an experience in my family. My grandfather, which is now passed on, when I was growing up, we thought he was an alcoholic. We didn't really know back then what alcoholic was, right? In other words, he drank almost like every day, went to work. But just one day, he just quit. Why is it that some people, like my grandfather, lived in his 90s, drank every day of his life that I was growing up? How can some people stop using substance and others cannot? Some of them end up dying because of, be it drunk driving or whatever. What is that? Was he an alcoholic or was he just drinking? Because he did it every day.
Well, can't just stop. They have withdrawal, and it's a medical issue. People can die from those withdrawals, particularly when you're talking about alcohol or benzodiazepines like Xanax and things of that nature. You can't just abruptly stop that.
Well, I'm happy that you mentioned those, because in our final segment, that's exactly where I want to go, Miss Karen.
Okay.
Thanks for watching Medical Talk. We're talking about addiction and recovery with addiction recovery professional Karen Morgan. Now, Karen, let's talk about some other substances that we've covered. Alcohol, everybody know. For some reason, people think alcohol is really just it. So I'm going to kick back and I'm going to learn something. I want you to take us through the other substances that also are affecting people in a very negative way out here.
Okay. Well, of course, we see meth a lot, particularly in rural areas. It's a very cheap drug to make. There's no real detox protocol for meth other than rest and sleep. Rest and eating, because a lot of times people don't eat when they're using meth. And then there's of course cocaine, and there's opioids. Now we know about the opioid epidemic. We're losing about 140 people a day to overdose.
Still?
Yes.
We don't hear about that as much as we used to.
No, and we should. But, interestingly enough, more people die from alcohol than do from opioids, and always have. And so it's important to note that, because alcohol is legal, and so, there's this huge debate about legalizing marijuana. And I'm not saying that marijuana is a benign drug, because it isn't. It certainly has its issues. But alcohol has been legal for a very long time and kills more people. And then, like I said, there's opioids, and I'm not just talking strictly about street opioids like heroin. I'm talking about prescription pain medication. And then, of course, there's prescription benzodiazepines, which are like Xanax and Valium and Klonopin. And those, of course, are abused. And you can become very addicted. It impacts the same area of the brain that alcohol does. And so if you abruptly stop taking it, you can have seizures and you can die. So it's really important to have medical oversight for that. And I'm sure I'm leaving out other drugs because there are just so many. Of course, speed, and then of course there are stimulants, basically, and then there's that would be amphetamines. There was another one that it won't come to mind.
There's so many
steroids.
of them. Steroids.
There's
really.
Still, so it really is, and it's all about changing the way one feels. And one of the things that's a pet peeve of mine is people saying, well, they're just trying to get high. Well, what does that mean exactly? Do you think they're having fun? Because when someone becomes addicted, it's not fun anymore. Their brain has to have that in order just to feel normal. Because what happens when you have this release of dopamine that is like 5 times what the brain is used to, it starts pruning away those receptors. And so you feel flat, you feel depressed, you can't enjoy anything that you normally would unless the drug is on board. Okay. And that's why it is so difficult to stop. And it takes a long time, depending on the drug and depending on how long someone's been taking that drug. It takes a long time for the brain to return to normal. And so it's really difficult for someone, even if they go through treatment and they get detox and they're feeling better, that brain has not returned to normal, not even after a month. Depending on the drug, it could be up to 18 months before the brain returns to normal. So it's really important to keep that person engaged in the recovery process for as long as possible.
Okay, so let's go back. You mentioned a couple of minutes ago when you went down the list. Benzo. We don't talk about that a lot. So how do they affect, if it's about getting high, I guess I'm asking, how do you take benzos, and is it about the high or is it about some other feeling? And how do you know if you are addicted to something that doesn't make you high? Because I associate feeling with everything.
Well, what it's doing is it's not making you high, it's making you feel normal. It's releasing that dopamine into the brain so that you can feel normal. So it's not about being high, giddy, happy. That's not at all. It's feeling normal. It's coming up from that very down feeling and being able to think clearly and process thoughts and just kind of enjoy life, or just having just regular pleasures, enjoying a meal, enjoying a moment with someone and looking at the sunset or the stars in the sky and feeling something. It takes substances once someone becomes addicted in order to be able just to feel that.
Okay, so why did that person have the need to feel normal in the first place when we should already be normal? Could that be the mental illness side of it that you mentioned earlier, like anxiety and those kind of disorders?
Right. Yeah. So, people generally that have anxiety are probably going to be prescribed a benzodiazepine. I just don't think that's a great idea. Not straight out of the gate. Let's talk about some ways that you can reduce your anxiety naturally as opposed to taking a medication. Because after a while, your brain might be different from mine. Your brain might maybe take one once a month, and you're fine.
Right.
You may have an episode, you're fine. Me, I have to take one every night. And then after a little while, it's like, oh, that's not enough. Now I'm taking 2, now I'm taking 3, and now I'm taking it all day long.
Wow.
So, and you just don't ever know when a physician prescribes that. You just don't know. It's very subjective.
Okay, so is one or the other worse for the individual? And which one? Let's talk about fentanyl. Do you have to deal with counsel individuals that, because I hear now fentanyl is sort of kind of added into everything. So we have about 1 minute. Let's talk about fentanyl, because I know it's so deadly.
It absolutely is. It's very, very strong. It's much stronger than heroin, and it is being cut. Heroin is being cut. Marijuana even is being cut with it. And if you're buying drugs on the street, like pills, a lot of times you don't know. You don't know where they're coming from, and they could also be cut with it. So even if you're not taking an opioid, you could very well get an opioid just because you don't know what you're dealing with.
Well, Karen, I would like to thank you so much again for joining me today. Give us really quickly your website for someone who may need addiction counseling.
Okay. Well, you can go to www.addictionrecoverysupportservices.com.
Okay, thank you. I would like to thank Karen Morgan for joining me today on Medical Talk to bring awareness to addiction behaviors and recovery. I'm Betty LaMarr. From all of us at GHS TV, thank you for watching Medical Talk, and I hope to see you again soon.
Hi, I'm Angelica reporting live from LaMarr Productions in East Memphis. Thanks for watching Let's Talk with Betty LaMarr. Betty is renowned for her successful medical talk show, and now you're invited to watch the space for her new production, Let's Talk, which is laser focused on issues affecting young girls and women in the community.